and welcome to Wellness Live. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and this broadcast is brought to you by Loma University Health's Department of Risk Management's Living Whole Wellness Program. We are so excited to have you here this month of March of 2022 to talk about a really important topic. We have been in quite the past 2 years, haven't we? With COVID coming on, with losing people, with all of the relationships that COVID has stressed out, there has been a lot of basically sadness and suffering around us. And so we thought we would have a really great topic today, and hopefully it'll help you, and I think it'll help all of us, is that it's the topic of suffering in the midst of crisis. And we have a very special guest. It's a guest that I have known actually for many years since he was in college. It is Dr. Saul Barcelo, and he is the director of the Center for Whole Person Care here at Loma University. So if we lost our audio, I'm so sorry. Can you hear us now? Okay, perfect. So I will say this again. Maybe I'll go back. I just want to thank all of you for being here today. This is Wellness Live. My name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and this is brought to you by Loma University Health's Living Whole Wellness Program. Now, we have been in quite a few couple of years here, or a number of months, when it comes to COVID. We've lost people that we love. I think COVID has touched many of us. It has put a strain on our work life. It has put a strain on maybe even our relationships. And the sad part here about all of this is that we've been in crisis for 2 years. So this topic that we're going to have here today is actually, I think, a very timely one that says, where and how does spirituality fit during these times of crisis? Well, I'm very excited to be having our speaker here today. I've known Dr. Barcelo for many years, even when he was in college. He is now the director of our Center for Whole Person Care here at Loma Linda University Health, and I think he's a great person to talk about where does spirituality fit in times of crisis. So without further ado, Dr. Barcelo.
Thank you, Dr. Moses. For the last few months, I did enjoy hearing from all the presenters that you have brought to this platform. And again, I'm grateful that you also asked me to share a little bit about from my background. In 1978, electrical workers making repairs in the basement of a bookstore in downtown Mexico City uncover a carved stone displaying a dismembered body of a woman. Archaeologists called to inspect this monolith and learn how this astonishing discovery represented the Aztec moon goddess Coyolxauhqui. This discovery led to a major excavation in the surrounding areas. If you were to visit Mexico City today, you'll be able to see not only the foundations of the Great Temple, part of the ancient city of Tenochtitlan, but you will see this site and also a museum that continues to display this stone. According to Aztec spirituality, Coyolxauhqui, in the Nahuatl translated bell hair chick, is the sister of a war god Huitzilopochtli. If you continue to analyze this image, you'll see that Coyolxauhqui is naked, which is not common in their culture. Perhaps it's inviting us to see her vulnerability. Similarly, if this image was actually in color, you could see more details about her and what has taken place. Well, we don't have the time to highlight these cultural significances. You can see she has glimpses of royalty, but also there are cuts in her arms, legs. You can even identify some of her bones. Now, there are a few versions that explains the reason for her disjointed body. All of them seem to underline a tragic event. The most popular version of this story tells us that Coyolxauhqui's mother was cleaning the temple, and a magic feather fell on her, and she became pregnant. Coyolxauhqui was jealous. Other version says she was angry. Nevertheless, she called her 400 brothers to avenge the honor of her family before they tried to kill her. Her mother gives birth to Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, and later became the war god. And not only did he defend his mother, he also seemed to decapitate Coyolxauhqui and threw her down the quote unquote serpent mountain, where her hands, legs, and body pieces separated. As with ancient stories, there are multiple meanings. Historians argue the mutilated image is actually a representation of the cities the Aztec Empire defeated with the help of their great sun warrior, Huitzilopochtli. Anthropologists interpret that figure to be more of an allegory for the different phases of the moon. Even feminist thinkers propose the monolith to be an actual scientific book displaying a birthing diagram, which reminds all of us the process of being broken before we can give birth to something new. Worthy of note, this account does not end with a mutilated Coyolxauhqui at the bottom of the stairs of the temple. Instead, the narrative concludes with Coyolxauhqui being transmuted into the moon. Humans are able to see her every night as they look at the dark sky, and they can be reminded that a new identity is possible after a tragic event. Latinx thinker Gloria Anzaldúa, in her reflection after the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001, she describes the pain that individuals and society experience after this event. And as she looks at this narrative, she concluded that there's something here for us to learn. Anzaldúa suggests that while a tragic event like this one has violently disrupted our lives, the Coyolxauhqui account can move us to work towards rebuilding ourselves in hopes of becoming whole once again, which is the message of Loma Linda University Health. Dr. Anzaldúa says, when fragmentations occur, you fall apart and feel as though you've been expelled from paradise. Coyolxauhqui is my symbol, she says, for the necessary process of dismemberment and fragmentation, of seeing that self or the situation you're embroiled in differently. But it is also my symbol for reconstruction and reframing, one that allows for putting the pieces together in a new way. The Coyolxauhqui imperative, she calls it, it's an ongoing process of making and unmaking. There's never any resolution, just the process of healing. The path of each individual that creates a creative impulse. What I call, she says, Coyolxauhqui imperative is basically an attempt to heal the wounds. It is a search for inner completeness after being split, dismembered, or torn apart. Each individual has to pull herself together, remember, and reconstruct herself on another level. As a chaplain working in the Children's Hospital, I encounter many families going through crisis. And while all of us are committed to helping, there are many instances in which patients and their families says, you know what, I do not need anything from you. Especially those who right away see myself as a chaplain associated with religion. I remember one parent in particular, after his son was brought up to Pete's ICU, he said, you know, chaplain, I'm not religious. I don't need you. All I need is for my life to go back. I need to go back to work. My business needs me. My family needs me. But now I'm stuck in this hospital, not knowing what's going to happen to my son. In a book that I would highly recommend, and unfortunately I won't have a lot of time to unpack, Dr. Ronnie Janoff-Bullman, professor of psychology, in her book, Shatter Assumptions Towards a New Psychology of Trauma, she explores the core assumptions that we as cultures have absorbed. The key concept that it is when our assumptions are shattered, like the case of this family or this parent, we are at a loss to explain reality. Our world collapses around us as we realize that we believe everything we believe to be true about our world is no longer true. Dr. Ronnie proposes that our three fundamental assumptions that are shattered are the following. The world is meaningful. Number two, that the world is benevolent, things that we learned from grade school. And also, the self is worthy. After a tragic event, there is a need to put the pieces together, to find meaning. And perhaps this is what renowned psychiatrist and philosopher, Dr. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, he wrote his book, and historians tell us he actually wrote his book, Men's Search for Meaning, in 9 days. As he reflected in his torturous weeks and months in a concentration camp, while he didn't want to address every single detail, he chose to say the following: man is not destroyed, and I will add woman, man and woman are not destroyed by suffering. He or she is destroyed by suffering without meaning. In my last few minutes together, I want to just dive in and propose that spirituality actually plays an important role in helping us make sense and bringing meaning and purpose to our situation, regardless of how tragic it is.
So, Dr. Barcelo, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in. This is such a timely thing. You got some really good things in what you said, and now I want to talk all about it, but we'll get to the questions here. And that is, how can people tend to their spiritual health during times of crisis? Anything practical? I think that's what they're looking for here. And maybe this goes into the second question is, what are the qualities of good spiritual health? Maybe you can answer both of those questions together.
Uh, it's interesting that they asked this question. I'm thinking in particular, the pandemic. One of the difficult things the pandemic did for all of us is that just kind of separated us, isolated us. And we are meant to live in relationship. And one of the great things that religion and spirituality does is it brings people together. You can argue the negative side effects of that. There's drama, there's conflict. Nevertheless, coming together. And so finding, I think, a spirituality that brings support, that brings community, that perhaps invites us to maybe practice certain rituals. And for some of us who maybe grew up in a very religious, community, we may feel like we're moving away from rituals, but rituals, they still give us meaning. There's a reason we celebrate Christmas. There's a reason Easter comes around. We try to remember and do certain things that at the end help us to see beyond the tense and the crisis that we're facing on a daily basis.
You mentioned a lot about, I loved your story about putting things together after being shattered. And I think that is something that we can all relate to. Can you walk us through not staying in that shattered place, that part of putting together? Because I think that is the hard part about it, right? Because I think we'll all be shattered at some point in life. How do we not stay there?
I think we have to, first of all, accept the fact that we're not going back. There's never a way of returning to the original form, the original experience, original life. If we can understand, perhaps it will be easier to begin this process of putting the pieces together. And I think that's where most of us are stuck. We want to go back to when we were younger. We want to go back to when we were stronger. We want to go back when everybody was happy. But the reality is, post-pandemic, there's certain things we can't do like we used to do back in the days. There's certain things either based on our age, our health, or a broken relationship. We cannot revisit the past, but today, if we can acknowledge that we have this opportunity to put the pieces together, maybe that could be the first step.
So you actually bring up a good point. So it sounds like there needs to be a little bit of a mourning process of maybe that past situation, and maybe to look at it also maybe realistically that it might may not be as perfect as we're kind of remembering it also. So here's another thing is you as a chaplain, and you've seen this shattered part of life probably more than most because you see people probably a lot at their worst. As you see this pain, we as people who are watching someone's pain, how can we help them in the process of potentially getting to the part where we're putting back together the pieces?
Ooh, that's a deep question that I think all of us ask at some point, especially if we can't really relate to their experience. But nevertheless, I think this is something, regardless of our title, our expertise, our training, you know, we're still human beings. And we can all think of an experience in where we were disappointed, our life was shattered, we experienced a crisis. And you know how that feels. Perhaps as we think about that experience, we can stand in solidarity with a person in front of us. Yes, their story is a little different than us. We may not be able to relate to everything, but before we talk, we can just stand next to them. And hopefully, as we begin to build trust and learn about them, because it's not about us, maybe we can start figuring out where we come in, where our expertise, where our background, where my spirituality can help you. But always we go with an agenda. I'm going to help you. I always think of a friend who had a great community with so many resources, and during a tragic event, fires here in San Bernardino almost 10 years ago, he went to the site where everybody, all the people who had been evacuated. And he says, I have a bunch of physicians, dentists, nurses who can come and help. And the lady says, I don't need doctors, dentists, or nurses. I need somebody who can clean the toilets. And so sometimes we come with an agenda. I want to help you. Yes, but maybe we should let those tell us how can we help them. That may be the beginning.
That's great. Well, why don't we get to the next half of your presentation?
Thank you. So perhaps we should define spirituality, because I know there will be, and I guess no one will agree with one particular definition. And I think that's what Dr. Craigie in his book, Positive Spirituality in Healthcare, tells us. You know what? At the end of the day, even if we don't agree, there's a couple of things that we have to remember. Spirituality is personal. It's something that, that I experience, that you experience. And then before I can tell you a definition, before I can put it into word, just you have to remember that I had this experience. Think of a mother who told me at the bedside that she's seen an angel next to her daughter. This gave her strength. I couldn't prove that. And I was thinking scientifically, are you sure it was not a nurse? I mean, our nurses are amazing here at Loma Linda. But I mean, for her, spirituality is personal. And that's something that was helpful for her. Spirituality is also an experience. Again, before we put it into words, we can think of something that happened that make us think, hey, this is why spirituality is experienced. Also, Dr. Craigie says that spirituality is a narrative. So that's why it's important to ask, not just have questions, but ask your story. What is your story? He says spirituality is embodiment, not a specialty. So it composes more things than just what we think sometimes of church, Bible, reading this or prayer. And then one thing that he says, and I think all of us agree, is spirituality is not the equivalent of religion, yet there are many components that are somehow connected. One of my favorite definitions comes from a former professor of school religion, Dr. Saul. Perhaps some of you got a chance to meet him. In his beautiful book, When Sickness Heals, he defines spirituality in this way. Perhaps we can define spirituality as the coexistence of the inner realization of something bigger than ourselves, and the inner ontological drive to make sense and make meaning of our existence within the physical, sociopolitical, environmental, and intrapsychic world in which we find our existence. I think most definitions will agree it has to do something with meaning, give us meaning in whatever situation we may be facing. Dr. Michael Balboni, in his book Spirituality and Religion Within the Culture of Medicine, does tell us that, you know what, it gets tricky. We define religion and we define spirituality, and we sometimes break it apart either for research, for academic purposes. But at the end, certain people are still gonna just be using a little bit of spirituality and a little bit of religion, whatever works for them to help them cope with their situation. Dr. Harold Connick, in his book, Spirituality in Patient Care, reminds us that most people in the United States, at least as of 2011, felt that it was better to identify themselves with a religious community of faith. Now, it didn't mean that people actually agree with all the doctrines, and they practice all the rituals, but at least most of them want to identify and want to say, I'm part of this, I'm part of something greater than myself. And again, this is a research I leave to you that you can find in many articles or books regarding spirituality and religion. Again, Dr. Harold Connick does remind us that just because people may not choose the label of religion and say, I'm part of Christianity, I'm part of Islam, I'm part of this or the other, he says, there's a good chance that someone will describe themselves as spiritual, since about 1 in 5 Americans consider themselves as spiritual, but not religious. So that's as important. And that is something that we should remember, especially, like Dr. Olivia Moses asked, if we want to help those who are going through a crisis, what is the role of spirituality in a time of crisis? Well, perhaps I want to just share 3 things. There's a lot that we can cover, but because of our times, I do want to say that spirituality, especially at tragic times, gives meaning in the midst of suffering. There was a study done by Marion Brady and Amy Pedersen, titled A Case for Including Spirituality and Quality of Life Measurements in Oncology, where they highlighted patients who went through cancer. And in this particular patient population, 93% of them says that it was thanks to their spirituality that they were able to go through the treatments. 75% of these patient population that was interviewed felt that their religious and their spirituality was helpful, not only as they go through the treatment, but as they look for a future with their loved ones, hopefully with a hobby or a job, something they want to do in the near future. And believe it or not, 49% of these patients that were interviewed, they said their faith actually became stronger after they were diagnosed with cancer. Spirituality give us meaning in the midst of suffering. Also, spirituality give us the ability to face adversity. Another interesting article, perhaps it's a little bit much older, but it was still helpful, and it was always helpful for me working with parents in Pete's oncology and Pete's ICU. This article, If I Should Die Before I Wake, Religious Commitments and Adjustment to the Death of a Child, Judith Cook and Dale Wimberly highlighted the work done with 145 parents, where they asked them about their situation after they lost their little one, their son, their daughter. 80+% felt that they found comfort due to their religious and spiritual beliefs, even a year after the loss of their little one. These parents were actually able to cope better psychologically and emotionally and integrate to the daily tasks of their family and their responsibilities in society. These results show that the religious commitment is both cause and consequence of adjustment to bereavement, in that religion can serve as a source of compensation for the loss of a child, said Judy Cook and Dale Wimberly. Perhaps this is maybe what Paul, one of the most influential writers within Christianity, in his book or letter to the Thessalonians, he says, brothers and sisters, after they had experienced a loss and they were wondering if something was going to happen after the loss of their loved one, he says, brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who fell asleep, those who are dead. You do not grieve like the rest of people who have no hope. We believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep. This passage of scripture is not just to give us comfort today, but it's a reminder how for hundreds and hundreds of years, communities of faith found comfort in their belief system, even as they experienced crisis, tragic events, and even death. One last thing that I want to suggest to you is the spirituality, especially at a time of a crisis. Give us a sense of connectedness. Yeah. Brian Goodman in his article "Faith in a Time of Crisis" explores what research has shown, especially during the pandemic, and what has been helpful for those struggling during this pandemic. Again, research indicates that faith played an important role, because some people see religion and spirituality as making them feel part of something larger than themselves. This can happen through maybe prayer, meditation, or through taking part in a religious meeting, listening to spiritual music, or even going on a retreat, walking outside. Before we conclude, I want to leave you with this image. This is actually a painting from famous Dutch painter Rembrandt, titled "The Storm on the Sea of Galilee" from 1633. It's actually inspired on the story of Mark chapter 4:35. You know that story where Jesus is sleeping in the boat. Actually, the story is mentioned 3 times in the gospel, perhaps as a reminder that there's something important here. And again, we don't have enough time to dissect it. But one thing that you should know about this story is that it starts just like our lives, going from point A to point B. And out of nowhere, there's a storm, there's a crisis, a situation that changes. And while the disciples are experts, this is not their first storm that they encounter. They realize that at some point, their expertise, their education, all the things they knew, their certifications is not helping, is not changing. It wasn't until they realized that Jesus is actually in the boat that their situation changed. Perhaps a reminder for us about the power of spirituality, connecting to the divine, even during these moments of crisis.
Thank you, Dr. Barcelo. Wow, that was a very powerful ending. That story about Jesus is always in our boat is something that I will definitely remember. We have some questions that are coming through here, so I'm going to go ahead and ask some of them. It says, during times of crisis, what populations do you feel are most vulnerable to mental or spiritual health decline?
Great question. You could argue, and again, I'm not an expert, but I would say that you can argue the older population, it's more perhaps they're used to seeing people face to face. The newer generation has technology, even though it hasn't replaced face-to-face, nevertheless, they can always found through social media, through Zoom, ways in which we connected. The funny thing during the pandemic is seeing grandparents, grandma, finding a way to connect via Zoom. And even though they struggle, they found a neighbor or somebody, because I felt that they were the ones who miss out more in this idea of community, of connecting with others. I don't want to minimize. I think also younger generations struggle, even though they may not recognize. They did have social media and technology to assist and help them, but perhaps older generations are the ones who struggle the most.
Okay, another question I think that is an important one is, are there any resources that can help me boost my spiritual health?
Mm.
You listed a number of them actually here.
I did mention a little bit about things that are so simple, from taking the time to just kind of reflect on our journey, or even on the crisis that we're going through. Think about it. Even after a long day of work, what is the first thing we do? We look at our phones, we turn on the radio. If we could just have a moment of quietness, of mindfulness, of prayer, meditation, that could begin help us understand, where are we in our life? What do we need? And maybe connect us to the divine. Other things is obviously finding community, support. And I think there's an importance that we should see rituals as something important in our lives. And perhaps we can maybe at some point have a conversation on the importance of rituals.
Sure, no, absolutely. It's very interesting that you say that. This idea of suffering, to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's many things that connect us, but suffering is one of them. I mean, all of us have suffered at some point in time, and we can discuss the extent of the suffering and that type of thing. However, It's one thing that connects us because it's something that we can see in others and see our pain in them. So it is something that not only can we help ourselves, but we can help other people through that process, which is what you're saying, which I think is great. Here's another question. What has been the most common spiritual need of our COVID-19 patients?
Oh, I think it's having someone face to face. Again, we are meant to be in community.
Mhm.
This idea, and perhaps in our own society here in the US, it's all about independence, right? No, it's about community. At some point we ignore what was happening in one part of the world, and eventually we face the same situation. Why? Because we are all interconnected. And so I think our patients can feel that as they miss out on worship with their faith and community faith rituals. Again, some of us think about the Sabbath, what takes place on Friday nights, Jewish population, also Muslims, and again, I think at the end of the day, we are connected, and I think that's perhaps what we miss the most during this pandemic.
I think you're right. I think, I think of people who've lost loved ones and they couldn't even be in the hospital at their bedside,
Mm.
while they were declining. So the person feels alone in the hospital. The person who is out of the hospital feels it's that connection that is lost. And even more so when you can't even be there toward those last days. I think that part of suffering that I think you mentioned is it's so important. So I'm going to repeat it again. This idea of connection, whether it is through social media or Zoom or whatever, we have to make a deliberate effort to connect with each other, not only in times of crisis, but in times of happiness as also. And I think COVID has actually sheltered us from that connection piece. So I think that's a to-do for all of us as we end our session today. Thank you, Dr. Saul Barcelo, for being with us here today. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for being with us as well. And I want to share with you what we are going to be talking about next month. That is April 28th, 2022, if you're watching us live. We are talking about emotional safety in the workplace. And we will have Dr. Jana Boyd here, who is our director of our Employee and Students Assistance Program. I think that's going to be a good one because a lot of times we talk about physical safety, but not emotional safety. Well, again, I would like to thank you. Hopefully, we'll see you on next month. And thank you for joining us here today. Again, my name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and we'll see you next time.